you know, I grew up in Ohio, right? And I'm an Irish American. I have a French last name because my ancestors were Huguenots. So they were people who, you know, fled France to Ireland. So that's why, you know, as an Irish person of Protestant heritage, I have a French last name. But I grew up around people, lots of people with German last names. My first grade teacher was Mrs. Wenger. My second grade teacher was Mrs. Schumacher. My kindergarten teacher was Mrs. Hartman. My fourth grade teacher was Mr. Hurst, right? My fifth grade teacher was Miss Hines. My sixth grade teacher was Miss Pricing. Lots of Germans I grew up around. And you know, I was in Ohio in a rural area, and you know, I mean, there were even some of these old German religions, like Mennonitism was very big among the people I grew up around. Mennonites, we would see Amish people. They went to separate schools. They didn't speak English. They spoke Pennsylvania Dutch. We saw Amish people. They were around. You'd see a buggy go by every so often. There were apostolics. There were Church of the Brethren members. And these were all 48ers that I mean, the folks that I went to school with German last names, you know, most of whom they were people whose ancestors had moved to Ohio in 1848. In 1848, you had the attempted German Revolution. And some of the most radical people in it were these fanatical Protestant sects. Bet you didn't know that. But yeah, the 1848 revolution, it was the peasantry of Germany and the workers of Germany rising up and demanding a German nation state, right? There were a bunch of principalities and local feudal governments. They wanted a modern nation state. And what was the anthem of the revolution in 1848? What do you think it was? Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles. You know, which is, now that's an anthem people associate with Nazism and stuff like that. But that was the anthem of the 1848 revolution, because they were fighting, it was progressive. They were fighting for a nation state, which would be a democratic republic, which would, sweep away the power of these local, these local autocrats, right? That was the 1848 revolution. And it wasn't just religious fanatics who fled from Germany in 1848. I mean, I grew up around people whose ancestors had been Mennonites and Brethrens and whatever. And they were all descended from what you call the Anabaptists, right? Anabaptists, that was the fanatical sects in Germany. People, they didn't believe in infant baptism, right? Most Christians believe that the baby is baptized when it's born, but there were these radical religious people in Germany who felt like you should baptize people when they get to be 14. Or when they're 8 or 9 or whatever, right? You don't baptize babies, you baptize people when they reach a certain age. And those folks, they didn't like the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church believed in infant baptism. But the main reason was the Catholic Church was feudalism. And a lot of the Protestants, like the Lutherans and others, were in bed with feudalism. And the Anabaptists were some of the most radical people in Germany. But you also had Marxists, and August Willich and Joseph Wedemeyer, two Germans who fled Germany after the 1848 revolution failed. Marx went to London, but August Willich and Joseph Wedemeyer and hundreds of other people that were communists. They were part of Karl Marx's Communist League, and they fled Germany, and they moved to Ohio and Pennsylvania and all across the United States, and they actually laid the basis of modern Marxism. The German Americans were the first Marxists in the United States, and actually, if you go way back, you go back to the 1840s, 1850s, just like now, or just like, people, in the 1920s and 30s thought communism was for Jewish people, just like, in the 1970s, people associated radical politics with black people. Well, you go back to the 1840s, communism and Marxism and radical politics was associated with Germans. Bet you didn't know that, but German Americans faced discrimination, and the stereotype of a German American was that a German American would be a fanatical, communist radical, or a religious fanatic, which again, the world changes, but in 1848, the religious fanatical Germans and the communist Germans were on the same side against the Catholic Germans and against the status quo. That doesn't make sense now. You think of religious fanatics and Marxists being on opposite sides, but history has a weird way of working itself out. And yes, the Red 48ers, they were called. Those are Germans who came to the United States in 1848. They formed a Marxist battalion, a Marxist regiment in the American Civil War called Die Neuner, or the Ohio 9th Regiment. the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment, and it was led by Joseph Wedemeyer, who was a Marxist, and they waved a red flag in the battlefield during the American Civil War, and they guarded St. Louis, Missouri, and they fought on the battlefields of Missouri during the American Civil War. I bet you didn't know that, but yes. And August Willich, who was a German-American immigrant, who was a friend of Karl Marx, he even rose to the rank of brigadier general in the Union Army. They made him a general in the Army, because he was such a good military leader, and he was a German Marxist. And yes, there was, the American Civil War, folks. People don't realize that the American Civil War was a revolution, right? It was slavery, which was the social system of half the United States at that time, the slave plantation system, backed up by Wall Street, backed up by the British Empire, and it was smashed. They broke apart the slave system. They broke slavery. And in order to do it, Abraham Lincoln had to build a huge popular front, a huge coalition, right? The Republican Party, when it was formed, they took their name from 1848, from all those revolutions in Europe that were led by Republicans fighting for a republic, like the Germans, the French, whatever. They were the Republican Party, and Abraham Lincoln was a populist, right? He was from Illinois, which at that point was the Wild West of the United States. He was from Illinois. He was this tall lawyer with a deep voice from Illinois, right? And he was known for courageous deeds in courtrooms, like helping women that were domestic violence victims and sticking up for poor people who were being arrested for stealing food. And he was a populist from Illinois. And he, the Republican Party, when it started, the slogan was free land, free labor, free men. Free land, free labor, free men. They were the party of the trade unions. They were the party of the small farmers, who they called the free soilers, who didn't believe in slavery. They were for independent small farmers. They were the party of capitalists, of industrial capitalists. You read, Abraham Lincoln, yes, problematic in many ways by our standards, but you read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it comes across this man is a populist, right? He says, thank God we live in a country where men have the right to go on strike. He condemns capitalists. He says the capitalists generally come together to fleece the people, right? He's a populist. He is an organizer, and they write songs about him, Lincoln and Liberty, too. They have another song about Lincoln that they, old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness. He was seen as a people's man. When he got elected, he didn't even want to end slavery. That was the wild thing. He just wanted to stop slavery's power. The slave plantation owners were out of control. They were maintaining not only that they had slavery, but that the whole rest of the country had to cooperate with slavery. They were, they had, the fugitive slave law. That, if you're in a state that doesn't believe in slavery and a slave runs away, the government of that state has to cooperate with slavery and arrest the slave and take them back to the other state. Well, the rest of the country said, no, we don't want to do that. But, Supreme Court, we know about, Dred Scott and all of that. The Supreme Court was forcing the rest of the country. Furthermore, new states were coming into the country, right? New territories were coming in. And most of the country wanted those states to not be slave states. But the plantation owners and Wall Street and the British Empire were trying to make Texas and Kansas and states like that into slave states. So the new territories, they wanted to be new slave territories. Well, Lincoln came in as just kind of an uprising of the labor unions, of the religious abolitionist movement, of the small farmers, all kinds of people, against the slaveholders controlling the American government. They said, we are going to drive the slaveholders out of the American government. It was an anti-monopoly coalition. It was an anti-monopoly coalition against slavery and the big bankers and the British Empire. That's what it was. It was an anti-monopoly government. And of course, what happened? Immediately after Lincoln took office, they took up arms and tried to violently overthrow the government. So Lincoln was forced to build a coalition to beat back the slaveholders. And that coalition was broad and beautiful. Harriet Tubman became the first woman to lead soldiers into battle. And along the Combahee River in South Carolina, Harriet Tubman led soldiers to free African-American slaves and to kill the slave owners and free the slaves from plantation to plantation. Harriet Tubman was a military leader, the first woman to ever lead American soldiers into battle. You know, you had Frederick Douglass, right, who was going to the White House to meet with Abraham Lincoln, right? You had the Ohio 9th Regiment, the Marxist division of the Union Army. I mean, the Civil War was an explosion of popular power, of democratic upsurge. And afterwards, Reconstruction. Read W.E.B. Du Bois' book on Reconstruction. Because after the Civil War, there was a huge, huge effort, you know, to try and to essentially try and reconstruct the United States, to reconstruct the South, to provide public education to low-income people, to divide up the land of slave owners, and Reconstruction was defeated, and the troops were pulled out of the South. It was a huge disaster. Jim Crow segregation came into existence because Reconstruction was defeated, and so, you know, you read about that. W.E.B. Du Bois has an amazing, amazing book called Black Reconstruction, which is a history of the American Civil War and a history of the Reconstruction afterwards. You don't know how progressive. The moment after the Civil War, when land was being redistributed, when public education was being created, you know, white and black workers were standing arm in arm. There was some really amazing progressive stuff that happened in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it was broken apart by Wall Street and imperialism. And the Republican Party basically stabbed it in the back. You know, there was a compromise, and it was awful. But you wouldn't know that if you study American history the way it's generally taught. The way American history is generally taught, you get this Gone with the Wind narrative, that the South was the victim somehow. But actually, you really ought to see the movie Free State of Jones. That's a really good movie. It's pretty violent, pretty bloody, but it's a good movie about the American Civil War and what happened. All right, enough about that.